Explained by the Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Spartacus. Contact Report 230.
Well, then the following. Spartacus was a warrior for the oppressed. Despite all ancient reports, his origin is still unknown today, as is his death. It is said that he died in the Battle of the River in 71 BC, but his body was never found. The Romans had united all their military legions in this battle and thereby defeated the army of Spartacus. As punishment for the slave revolt, the victors then crucified more than 6,000 defeated slaves, namely along the Via Appia from Capua to Rome. In Capua, too, was the gladiator school, run by a certain Gnaeus Lentulus Batiatus, where Spartacus also learned his gladiator craft, before it came to an uprising in the spring of 73 BC by a few more than 200 gladiators in Capua when they stormed the prison kitchen, armed with all sorts of things they could just get their hands on. So the prison itself became the arena. I know some things about Spartacus, but if you know more about it, then please let me hear.
The term gladiator is based on the main combat tool of gladiators, the sword, which was called gladius in Latin language. Gladiators were not amateurs, but fiercely trained fighters. A gladiator training center was in Capua, and being a gladiator meant practicing a veritable craft to perfection, as any other craft was. The gladiators were true masters of the art of fighting and true fighting machines, whose only destiny was to kill the opponent in the fight and to remain victorious, and not only in the fighting arena. Truthfully, gladiators in special legions were actually also used for war purposes, which, however, has remained largely unknown to this day. The gladiator school of Gnaeus Lentulus Batiatus, whom you mentioned, was a strictly guarded prison with thick stone walls in which slaves were trained to become gladiators. Already the training often resulted in deaths, because ultimately they also fought with sharp weapons, which, however, were only given out for practice fights and then kept under lock and key again under strict guard. There were great and glorious heroes among the gladiators, but as a rule they were still no more than slaves without rights who were the property of slave owners, who used their enslaved fighters for betting, or who had to duel to the death for their owners over love affairs. The unbreakable rule of gladiators was simple. Every fight was to be fought for life or death or victory, whereby even for the best fighters there was no hope for a better or even a free future. Ultimately, every gladiator ended up in his own blood when he was killed by his enemy and sank into the dust of the arena. Some gladiators managed up to 10, 20, or rarely even 25 or 30 fights, but then they were so worn out and exhausted that they could not endure another fight and were killed by their opponent. And since there was no hope for the gladiators that they would ever be free and have a better life, the thought of insurrection was thus constantly smoldering among them, which was also known to the owners of slaves and the operators of the gladiator schools, as well as the guards, which is why they took enormous security measures against a revolt. This was also a reason why the gladiators were, for security reasons, only given sharp weapons when they had to fight in the arena or, which was rare, had to pass a special final test of combat training with sharp weapons, in which case there were already deaths. Otherwise, in the gladiator schools, only the guards were heavily armed, whereby every outbreak and revolt was already nipped in the bud. Nevertheless, the thought of an uprising was constantly smoldering among the gladiators, until in the spring of 71 BC, what was considered impossible by the slave owners and their guardians actually happened. 217 gladiators stormed the prison kitchen in Capua in the gladiator school and armed themselves with kitchen utensils suitable for fighting, such as skewers, meat axes, chopping instruments, and knives, etc., with which they then attacked their brutal guards. They fought against the guards with the courage of despair and used all the skills they had learnt during their training, and until then had applied in hopeless fights for life and death in the arena. However, the revolters had only limited chances against the heavily armed guards, which is also why 146 gladiators were killed by the guards before 71 of the insurgents were able to flee. The guards themselves became prisoners, for they could not flee through the closed doors and over or through the thick walls of the prison, and so many of the guards were massacred by the revolting slave gladiators. Their leader was the slave gladiator Spartacus, who originated from the Indo-European folk of the Thracians and was enslaved by the Romans when he fell into captivity. He belonged to an aristocratic family who were descendants of the tribe of Spartans, and he therefore had great fighting experience and warfare qualities even before his enslaved gladiatorial life, so it was understandable that he could take over the leadership role during the escape and keep it after the escape. Years prior to his enslavement and forced recruitment as a gladiator by the Romans, he fought in the war against their legions. The Thracians and various other folks stood up against the Romans when they were incited by the Pontic king Mithridates VI, and it was precisely during this war that Spartacus was captured and brought to Rome as a slave. Thus he changed from a fighter for freedom to a fighter in the arena, to a gladiator who had henceforth solely to fight for his life. And since he was as good as a perfectionist in the handling of weapons and in combat, had enormous physical strength and a high intelligence as well as a brilliant intellect and a good education, his destiny was sealed. Such persons were unceremoniously taken by the Romans to the gladiator elite school of Capua, where they, being experienced in weapons and combat besides fighting, also had the task of acting as gladiator trainers, which from then on was also Spartacus's fate. The revolt and the escape of the gladiators from the gladiator prison in Capua was certainly very annoying for the Romans, but at first nobody cared much about it, except for those legions who were chasing them. Actually, the 71 gladiators were now free, but they still could not lull themselves to safety, because in fact they always ran the risk of falling back into the hands of a fifth part of a Roman legion, about 1,000 men who followed and chased them. In Roman times, an entire legion comprised 4,000 to 6,000 men on foot and about 300 horsemen and the entourage. The legion was divided into 10 cohorts, that is to say 400 to 600 men each, as well as 30 maniples with 133 to 200 men and 60 sentries with 100 men each, and formed the highest unit of the Roman army. Then in the late antiquity, a legion was made up of only about 1,000 men. Although the gladiators had seized various weapons from the killed guards, so they had also, in that regard, quite a bit at their disposal, in addition to the kitchen instruments. But nevertheless their chances of staying alive were much smaller than just before, when they were still enslaved gladiators and had to fight for their lives in the arena. Thus, 71 slave gladiators were on the run and always in danger to fall into the hands of the bloodhounds, who outnumbered them several times. So the refugees had no choice but to keep on fleeing in order to escape the Roman legions chasing them. In so doing, however, they managed to raid and plunder a weapons transport destined for another gladiator school, so that the escapees could better equip themselves. Word got around, of course, and wherever the escaped gladiators appeared, slaves fled time and again from their owners and joined the Spartacus Legion, which is how the gladiator troop was now popularly known. and more joined in, also impoverished farmers and escaped prisoners, so that in the following weeks a small army assembled itself. This required that as soon as possible new weapons were obtained, and more armed men were sought and also found in large numbers and trained in the handling of weapons and in combat, which of course did not remain hidden to Rome, which now slowly began to feel uneasy and to worry, because now it was foreseeable that a slave war might loom. This was all the more dangerous because the Roman Empire had major domestic and foreign political problems, and the majority of its legions were engaged in warfare at practically all borders of the empire and beyond. Therefore, there was a lack of time and the necessary army to follow and fight against the increasingly rebellious gladiators and all their companions, the escaped slaves and prisoners, as well as the peasants and adventurers, and figures who had struggled for all sorts of reasons. Moreover, it was not glorious for the legions to militarily fight escaped slaves and prisoners, gladiators, peasants, and all sorts of rabble, in contrast to the situation when, through successful military campaigns at the borders of the empire or beyond, much fame and spoils of war could be gained. And exactly this attitude, as well as the lax chasing of the Spartacus legion, led to the fact that Spartacus was able to move through Italy almost unchallenged with his army, and to gather more and more people around him. Thus, for Rome, the size of the Spartacus legion grew to become an ever more encompassing and dangerous threat, and many Romans were confronted with anxiety. Then Spartacus set up a large camp in the volcanic crater of Vesuvius, where he felt safe with his army at least for the present situation. From there, raids were carried out in the immediate vicinity and further afield to obtain food, but also new equipment and weapons for all the many new slaves who had escaped and joined the gladiator group and its legion, impoverished peasants, adventurers, escaped prisoners, and criminals. Also further escaped gladiators, as well as further a social rabble of all kinds, joined the Spartacus legion, so that it finally comprised 11,803 men, which was roughly equivalent to 2 large Roman legions. The raids thus became bigger and bigger, extending farther and farther, and of course posed an ever-increasing threat to the security of the Roman citizens. Thus, the Roman Senate finally decided to take action against the 2 Spartacus legions. Thus, the propraetor, that is to say, the proconsul Gaius Claudius Glaber, was instructed to confront the threat with 3,000 military men provided to him and to destroy the 2 Spartacus legions. So a forced march to the volcano Vesuvius was undertaken by foot in the hope of blocking and occupying the only access from the valley to the Vesuvius crater and to encircle Spartacus with his 2 legions, which however ultimately failed profoundly. This because he underestimated Spartacus's intelligence, prowess, and war tricks, and carelessly waved to erect a palisade fence around his own camp. This was seen by Spartacus, and he took advantage of this grave error of the besiegers by at night having ladders made from wild vines, on which all the heavily armed Spartacus men rappelled down from the crater rim and raided the oftentimes sleeping Roman soldiers, who simply sought their salvation by fleeing. In this way, Spartacus defeated half a Roman legion with his legions and came into possession of the whole camp, including many food supplies, weapons, and all other Roman equipment. This made it all the more clear that one was no longer dealing with just a small slave uprising, but actually with a great threat. Therefore haste was suddenly called for, and under the command of the Senate and under the leadership of the praetor Publius Varinius, a new army was newly equipped. However, the Senate was mistaken about the newly grown army of Spartacus, which had in the meantime increased to several legions, and thus to 43,719 men due to further influxes, amongst them many Roman defectors. An enormous military power that therefore also defeated 2 legates sent out by the praetor and their legions. Legates were deputies or envoys of the emperor or the praetors, as well as permanent assistants of the military commanders and vicegerents. The praetor Publius Varinius barely escaped capture by Spartacus's warriors during the failed military campaign. Although the mighty Spartacus army had many successes, the more time went by, it became increasingly clear that it was only a community welded together by adversity, consisting of many members of different folks. Thus, Spartacus was originally eager to bring all of them back to their homelands because he knew that there was no future for any of them in the Roman land. Therefore, he also wanted to cross the Alps, from beyond which many Teutons and Celts in his army originated. However, a fellow sufferer named Crassus, who had been in Capua with Spartacus and stood by his side as leader, was not of the same opinion because he wanted to stay in the Roman land and lead the immense army against Rome. The two, however, could not agree to forge a joint action against Rome, which is why the two separated together with their personal supporters. Crassus remained in the south of the country in Apulia, whereby 9872 followers gathered around him. As Spartacus made his way north, 35,416 men from the army that had grown further moved with him. The Romans' anxiety grew enormously, as it was feared that Spartacus would now attack Rome. Therefore, the Senate decreed that a Gevalt strike against Spartacus and his legions should be led, in order to get rid of the danger, hence a total of 4 large legions as well as a considerable number of other troops, altogether little more than 30,000 men, were ordered under the command of Ganius Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus and Lucius Gellius Publicola, who, in the year 72 BCE, were both consuls and had therefore also the supreme command during times of war and authority over the legions. Of course, the Romans learned of the separation of Spartacus and Crassus, so they set out to take out Crassus and his fighters. This then took place at Mount Garganus in Apulia. Crassus had no chance, was defeated devastatingly, and died himself during this. Only a few survived the heavy fight and then made it to Spartacus, whose situation was very unpleasant as he had lost a quarter of his troops because of Crassus, which put him in a critical situation. The 2 consuls knew this, of course, and now they were deploying their troops against Spartacus and his legions. Thus, with might, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus obstructed the way to the north for Spartacus and his men, while Lucius Gellius Publicola, with the help of Quintus Arrius's legions, ensured that the way back was blocked. Another time the fate of Spartacus and his companions seemed to be sealed, but again he proved his strategic genius. He led his legions with those of the consuls to an open field battle, won, and put the enemies to flight. Then he commemorated his friend Crassus, who had been killed by the Romans, and had a pompous funeral service organized for him, in that Spartacus chose 311 captured Roman legionnaires who had to fight as gladiators with each other until death. Thus the Romans became aware that the former slaves, the peasants exploited and impoverished by the Romans, and the slave gladiators had not forgotten their former ignominy, and now transferred it to the captured legionnaires who had to fight for their lives as gladiators. Spartacus's action was a clear act of revenge, which did not appeal to the Romans at all, however, and was by them regarded as proof that Spartacus and his men were infested with the worst cruelty. They did not think about it, and it did not occur to anyone that the whole thing was nothing other than what they had done themselves. The Romans were so stubborn that they could in no wise comprehend the act of revenge. Spartacus, however, advanced further north with its legions and soon crossed the northern border of Umbria. Thus, he soon managed the difficult crossing over the Apennines and marched towards the Po Valley, where he was opposed by the praetor Gaius Cassius Lingonus with 2 legions, with 10,413 Roman legionaries, while Spartacus with his legions defeated the Romans again. So the time had come that he could now have crossed the Alps. But that did not happen, because no one was in favor of this plan any longer, because now all the Spartacus warriors wanted to march against Rome, because the steady battles with the Roman legions had stirred up the hatred in the rebels in such a manner they now wanted to destroy the Romans in their own country. Thus the march southwards was resumed, while in Rome the situation became more and more complicated and confused for the Senate and the population, and the anxiety grew more and more. In the autumn of 72 BCE, it was only with the greatest difficulty that the Senate was able to enthuse a volunteer to set out against Spartacus and his legions, namely via Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had become very wealthy during the reign of the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who also had the nickname Felix. Crassus armed any man who was able to hold a weapon, and thus assembled 6 new legions, irrespective of the fact that many were war invalids, hardly able to fight. He also incorporated the remains of the 4 beaten legions, and thus brought together an army of 53,608 legionnaires who set off with the slogan, "Total annihilation of the rebels." Under the command of Mummius, the legate appointed by Crassus, 2 Roman legions were sent out to follow Spartacus and his fighters, whereby Mummius was, however, ordered not to engage in any fight with Spartacus and his legions. But Mummius was ambitious and thought that he could win with his legionaries over the rebels, which is why he attacked them, whereupon he was defeated devastatingly. There were only a few survivors, and those took flight. Mummius, too, was among them, whose unauthorized actions led to the end of his career. The defeated and fleeing legionaries were called to account by Crassus and disciplined by determining and executing every 10th, namely in front of all legionnaires, which was meant to serve as a deterrent that no one any longer would flee and show cowardice vis-a-vis the enemy. And Crassus was boundlessly angry, which is why he now wanted to annihilate Spartacus and his legions with a single mighty strike. But Crassus was also mistaken, because when he and his army met, the one of Spartacus, the victory went again to the rebels, which also continued to be so, this not least because Spartacus always knew how to avoid a direct encounter. Thus they moved both armies slowly southwards, namely all the way down to the southern tip, note Billy Bash boot tip, of the Roman mainland, for example, Italy. And that appealed to Crassus, because now he could cut off Spartacus and his legions return to the north. For this purpose, his legionnaires had to build a wall with a length of just over 30 kilometers, thereby locking in the Spartacus army. At the narrowest point of the peninsula, moreover, a 4-meter deep ditch was dug, which was additionally protected on the back with a barricade. However, since Crassus knew Spartacus's war tricks and the fighting power of his legions, he requested support from the Senate in Rome by Gnaeus Pompeius and Marcus Licinius Lucullus. So a wearisome waiting period began on both sides of the armies ready for battle, whereby Spartacus forged plans to escape the looming annihilation. And since the land route was completely blocked by Crassus's troops, only the sea route remained open, and that would be the one over to Sicily. Thus the plan was forged that the crossing by ship should take place by Cilician pirates, because these dominated the strait between the Roman mainland and Sicily. Negotiations were also conducted in this regard, with the pirates demanding a very high price, which the Spartacus men had to pay in advance. However, the pirates were fraudsters, because they disappeared with all the money and left the rebels behind, but this only because Crassus paid the pirates 3 times the price. Spartacus, on the other hand, sent a scout to Sicily, who was, however, captured and crucified by the Romans and put on display directly at the harbor entrance. Spartacus and his legions were finally locked up and could flee neither across the strait nor across the land, and so Crassus could simply wait with his army until the plight of hunger drove the rebels out of their holes. And he did not want to enter into a compromise with Spartacus when the latter sent a messenger to him, so that he had to return to the camp of the rebels without having achieved anything. Thus, Spartacus not only ran ever shorter of time, but also of the food for the hungry men of his legions. Also, more and more diseases spread in his army, and many of the weakened fighters died away. He had their corpses secretly thrown into the ditch created by Crassus's army, along with tree trunks and stones, etc. Then Spartacus ordered a storm attack, which became a real massacre, in which 12,319 of his fighters were literally slaughtered by the Roman legions. Only a part of the Spartacus army was left and was able to flee, however, haunted by the legions of Crassus. During the flight, there were renewed disagreements among the rebels. Hence, Spartacus separated several thousand fighters another time and went separate ways with them. Obviously, this was welcome for Crassus, who chased the splinter group and attacked them as they set up their first camp. Still close together, Spartacus came with his main army to the aid of the attacked, and could only just prevent that the defectors were completely exterminated. Nevertheless, this no longer welded the breakaway men together with the main army, since after their rescue they continued to go their own ways. Thus, they moved to the north, where they were taken up only a short time later by Roman legions and destroyed to the last man. And Spartacus knew that Lucullus was on his way with his legionnaires, namely with ships to the port of Brundisium note Billy, today called Brindisi, on the east coast of the Boot, which is why he was very worried. Thus, 3 years after his escape from the gladiator prison in Capua, he ordered the last and desperate attack on the chasers, whereby the two armies then collided for many hours and, in addition to a real bloodbath, also left behind a field of deaths on which lay many thousands of Roman legionaries and umpteen thousands of rebels, all of whom had to fight tired and power-wise exhausted. The Spartacus fighters had no realistic chance, and Spartacus himself, too, suffered a severe stab wound that forced him to the ground. Nevertheless, he continued to fight against the legionnaires attacking him until he received a blow to the head with a sword, which, however, did not split his skull, but only tore a flesh wound open, causing him to fall to the ground, covered in blood and unconscious, and was left lying there, believed to be dead. Then, when everything was over and the night had arrived, Spartacus regained consciousness and left the battlefield half walking, half crawling, and thus fled from the Romans, whereby he was lucky that a helpful peasant found him, who took him in and cared for him for about 2 months, until he was well again. Afterwards, Spartacus set off unrecognized to return to his homeland, which he eventually reached after several months and lived there as a free man until the end of his life, also unrecognized, and died at the age of 61 years.
This is a long story. So, because he was able to flee, Spartacus was not found when they then searched for him on the battlefield.